Nestled deep in the mist-wrapped mountains of Okayama Prefecture, the small village of Tsuyama existed in near isolation, a place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of Japan. The year was 1938, and the town was little more than a cluster of wooden homes, terraced rice paddies, and dense forests that loomed like silent watchers. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the occasional cry of a distant crow or the whisper of wind through the cedars. At the edge of this village stood the Kamoshita family farm, a modest house with paper shoji screens and a thatched roof, surrounded by fields that had been worked for generations. The family was known, but not particularly notable. Sadayuki Kamoshita, a 30-year-old farmer, lived there with his wife, their 4 young children, and his elderly mother. To outsiders, they appeared ordinary, hard-working, reserved, the kind of people who bowed politely but kept their lives private. But there were murmurs. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Sadayuki's strange habits, how he would sometimes be seen standing motionless in the fields at dusk, staring into the trees as if listening to something. Others claimed he had once been found kneeling in the forest, whispering to the earth. The village children, sensing something unsettling, avoided him, spreading tales that he talked to the mountain, or that shadows followed him home at night. Then came the rumors of the red cloth. A traveling merchant swore he had seen Sadayuki leaving offerings at a forgotten shrine deep in the woods, not of rice or sake, but strips of crimson fabric tied to the branches. When questioned, Sadayuki only smiled and said, "They prefer red." No one asked who they were. As winter tightened its grip on Tsuyama, an unnatural stillness settled over the Kamoshita farm. The animals grew skittish. The family's youngest child began waking, screaming from nightmares, babbling about the man with no face in the trees. And then, on the night of the blood moon, the whispers in the village fell silent, because the real horror was just beginning. The village of Tsuyama slept in the shadow of the mountains, a place forgotten by time. Thick forests pressed in from all sides, their ancient trees creaking like old bones in the wind. The year was 1938, but in this remote corner of Okayama Prefecture, it might as well have been a century earlier. The villagers lived as their ancestors had, tending rice paddies that cascaded down the hillsides in emerald steps, their backs bent to the same sun that had watched over their bloodline for generations. Sadayuki Kamoshita's farm stood apart from the others, clinging to the edge of the wilderness like a man holding onto a cliff. The 2-story farmhouse had weathered decades of mountain storms, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of years. At night, when the oil lamps were lit, its paper windows glowed like eyes watching the dark. The family was ordinary in every way that mattered. Sadayuki, 30 years old with hands roughened by farm work, was a quiet man who spoke little but listened much. His wife Michiko kept the home with quiet efficiency, her laughter as rare as summer snow. Their 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, were bright-eyed and curious, though lately they had taken to huddling together at bedtime, whispering about bad dreams. Only grandmother Aiko seemed unafraid, her wrinkled face set in a permanent scowl as she muttered about old spirits and the price of disturbing the mountain. That autumn, something changed in Sadayuki. Neighbors noticed first. At the monthly market, where farmers traded rice and gossip, Sadayuki stood apart, his eyes darting to the tree line as if expecting something. The village priest found him one dawn at the abandoned shrine deep in the woods, arranging stones in strange patterns. When confronted, Sadayuki only smiled and said, "They're teaching me their language." Then came the whispers among the children. Young Haruto swore he saw Uncle Sadayuki walking in the moonlit fields with a tall shadow man. Little Saki cried that something had been scratching at her window at night, leaving deep grooves in the wood. The village dogs, normally silent, began howling at unseen things in the darkness. The final warning came from old man Yamada, who delivered firewood to the Kamoshita farm. "That house smells wrong," he told his wife, "like wet earth and something older. And Sadayuki's eyes, they don't reflect light right anymore." On the night of the blood moon, when the sky turned the color of a fresh wound, the wind died suddenly. An unnatural silence fell over Tsuyama. In the Kamoshita house, the family knelt for their evening meal, unaware that the last normal moment of their lives had already passed. Outside, the forest held its breath. Inside, the shadows in the corners grew teeth. The blood moon hung swollen in the sky, casting an eerie crimson glow over the Kamoshita farmhouse. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and owls had fallen silent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to choke the very air. Inside the house, the family went about their evening routines, unaware that the shadows in the corners had grown teeth. Sadayuki sat motionless in the main room, his calloused hands resting on his knees. His eyes, once warm and brown, now reflected the moonlight like polished stones, empty and depthless. A faint smile played at his lips as he hummed a tuneless melody, something that might have been a folk song from the mountains, or perhaps something much older. Michiko glanced at her husband as she cleared the supper dishes, her movements quick and nervous. She had noticed the change in him these past weeks, the way he sometimes stood for hours staring at the forest, the strange symbols scratched into the wooden beams of the barn, the nights he disappeared only to return at dawn with dirt under his fingernails and leaves in his hair. Upstairs, the children huddled together in their shared bedroom. Little Saki clutched her brother's arm, her wide eyes fixed on the window. "The shadow man is back," she whispered. "He's standing in the yard." Then the screaming began. It started with Grandmother Aiko, a shrill, terrified wail that cut off abruptly. The children heard something heavy fall, then the wet, meaty sound of an axe biting into flesh. Michiko dropped a ceramic bowl, which shattered like a gunshot in the unnatural silence. Sadayuki stood slowly, his movement smooth and deliberate. In his hands was the family's hunting rifle, its barrel glinting in the moonlight. His smile never wavered as he turned toward his wife. What followed was a nightmare of methodical violence. Sadayuki moved through the house like a man in a trance, his face eerily calm even as he butchered his family. The rifle's reports echoed through the valley, each shot perfectly placed. When the ammunition ran out, he switched to the axe, its blade flashing crimson in the moonlight. The children died where they slept. Michiko made it as far as the garden before she fell. Grandmother Aiko, despite her age, put up a fierce struggle. They found her fingernails broken and bloody, as if she had clawed at the walls in her final moments. As the last screams faded, an unnatural quiet settled over the farmhouse. Sadayuki stood amidst the carnage, his clothing soaked in blood, his breathing steady. With ritualistic precision, he arranged the bodies in a circle in the main room, placing strips of red cloth over each face. The blood pooled on the tatami mats, seeping into the floorboards with a sound like whispering voices. Outside, the wind began to howl through the trees. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, swirling like smoke. Sadayuki tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear, then nodded once. When the villagers came investigating at dawn, they would find the house silent, the bodies cold, and Sadayuki gone, leaving behind only a trail of bloody footprints that vanished at the edge of the forest. But that night, as the blood moon watched overhead, something stirred in the darkness between the trees. And from deep in the mountains came the faint, echoing sound of laughter. The blood moon hung low over Tsuyama, a pulsing crimson eye that stained the valley in shades of rust and dried viscera. An unnatural heat clung to the Kamoshita farmhouse, the kind that comes before a storm, thick with the scent of wet earth and copper. Inside, the shoji screens trembled without wind, their paper surfaces rippling like the skin of a dying man's drum. Sadayuki knelt in the darkened Irori hearthroom, his silhouette flickering in the guttering lantern light. His hands moved with methodical precision, polishing the family's antique rifle with oil that smelled suspiciously like rendered fat. Across the room, Grandmother Aiko watched through slitted eyes, her gnarled fingers clutching Buddhist prayer beads that clicked like insect mandibles. "The mountain is hungry tonight," she croaked, her voice the sound of dry leaves scraping stone. Sadayuki's head tilted at an unnatural angle, vertebrae popping like green wood in a fire. When he smiled, his teeth caught the light wrong, too many, too sharp. "We must feed it, Oba-san," he murmured, "just as you taught me." Upstairs, the children huddled beneath stained futons. 5-year-old Saki clutched her brother's wrist hard enough to leave bruises. "The man without a face is in the garden again," she whispered. Through the window, moonlight illuminated a towering silhouette standing perfectly still among the cabbages, its elongated limbs jointed all wrong, its head a smooth oval where features should be. The first scream came from the kitchen. Michiko's shriek shattered the night as she backed away from the storage nook where their winter provisions were kept. Jars of pickled vegetables now floated in dark liquid, their contents replaced by curled white things that might have been fingers. The earthen floor was wet where something had dragged itself from the cellar, leaving a glistening trail that led right to Sadayuki's feet. What happened next unfolded with nightmare precision. The rifle's first report sent crows exploding from the forest in a cacophony of black wings. Grandmother Aiko took the bullet through her prayer-clasped hands, the beads scattering like teeth across the tatami. The second shot caught Michiko mid-lunge toward the children's room, painting the shoji screens in arterial arcs. Sadayuki moved through the house with the eerie grace of a kagura dancer performing sacred rites. When the rifle jammed, blood clotting in the barrel perhaps, he switched to the firewood axe. Its blade made wet, chunking sounds as it found the children's small bodies still huddled in their futons. Little Saki was last. She stared up at her father with wide, understanding eyes as the axe descended. "Papa," she breathed, not in fear, but in terrible recognition. "You let it in." The massacre itself lasted precisely 33 minutes. When it was done, Sadayuki arranged the corpses in a perfect circle around the Irori, their heads pointing inward, like petals of some grotesque flower. He draped each face with strips of red silk from Michiko's wedding kimono, the fabric soaking up blood like thirsty tongues. Outside, the trees leaned closer, their branches scraping the roof like skeletal fingers. The faceless shape from the garden now stood in the doorway, its elongated limbs folding impossibly as it stepped over the threshold. Sadayuki bowed low, pressing his forehead to blood-slick tatami as the thing passed him to stand at the circle's center. When the villagers came at dawn, they would find the house ice-cold, despite the smoldering hearth. Every mirror shattered from the inside out, the children's futons neatly folded, as if ready for guests, and in the center of the carnage, a single perfect circle of untouched tatami where something had stood watching. But in those final crimson hours before sunrise, as the blood moon waned, the last sound in the Kamoshita house was neither scream nor prayer, but the wet, rending noise of something feeding in the dark. The chasing shadows. Dawn came reluctantly to Tsuyama, a pale gray light seeping through the mist like water through cloth. The village stirred with uneasy murmurs. Something was wrong. The Kamoshida farmhouse stood silent, its usual morning smoke absent. No clatter of pots, no children's laughter. Only the crows remained, perched on the roof in a silent, black-feathered vigil. It was Old Man Yamada who noticed the blood first. A single rust-dark droplet glistened on the stepping stone leading to the Kamoshida gate. Then another, and another. A trail of them, like breadcrumbs, led around the side of the house, not toward the road, but into the dense thicket of the forest. Yamada's breath hitched. His joints ached with the damp, but something deeper than fear prickled at his neck. He called for the others. By mid-morning, a dozen villagers stood at the tree line, clutching farming tools like weapons. The forest exhaled a cold, earthy breath as they stepped inside. The trail was unmistakable, smeared footprints, bare and bloody, pressing into the soft soil. Sadayuki's, no doubt. But something was wrong with the prints. They were too deep, as if whatever made them carried a weight beyond a man's body. The villagers followed, their voices hushed. The trees here grew unnaturally close, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes. One resembled a screaming face, another a crouching figure. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects. Just the occasional creak of branches like a house settling before collapse. Then they found the shrine. It was ancient, half swallowed by roots and moss, its torii gate sagging like a broken spine. The blood trail led straight to it, then stopped, as if Sadayuki had simply vanished into the earth. But it was the shrine itself that made the villagers recoil. The wooden amulets that once hung from its ropes were gone, replaced by strips of red cloth, each knotted in intricate, unfamiliar patterns. At the base of the shrine, something glinted in the dim light. Sadayuki's axe, its blade clean, as if licked spotless, and beside it, pressed into the dirt, was a single, child-sized handprint. Fingers splayed, as if something had crawled out. The morning mist clung to Tsuyama like a burial shroud as the first villagers approached the Kamoshida farm. No smoke rose from the hearth, no chickens scratched in the yard. Only an unnatural silence hung over the property, broken by the occasional creak of the farmhouse's aging timbers, sounds that seemed too loud in the stillness, like bones cracking underfoot. Old Man Yamada was the first to notice the blood. A single fat droplet glistened on the wooden engawa like a ruby. Then another, and another. A macabre trail leading around the side of the house, not toward the village road as one might expect, but straight into the waiting jaws of the forest. His gnarled hand trembled as he reached out, fingertips hovering just above the crimson spots. They were still warm. By noon, the entire village had gathered at the tree line, their murmurs hushed and fearful. The men clutched farming scythes and wood axes with white-knuckled grips, while the women pulled their children close, unconsciously forming a protective circle. The village priest, an aging Shinto Kanushi named Tanaka, stood before the assembled crowd holding a Ofuda purification charm that trembled slightly in his grasp. "The forest is not right today," whispered Mrs. Kobayashi, her eyes darting between the trees. Normally alive with bird song and insect chatter, the woods were preternaturally silent. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir the leaves. The search party moved in a tight group, their progress slow as they followed the intermittent blood trail. The deeper they penetrated into the forest, the more wrong everything felt. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against their skin like invisible hands. The tree trunks seemed to lean in closer, their bark taking on disturbingly anthropomorphic features. Here, a face twisted in agony, there a hand reaching up from the roots. Young Haruto, the blacksmith's apprentice, was the first to notice the footprints. "They're too deep," he muttered, kneeling beside a particularly clear impression. Indeed, the bloody prints sank nearly twice as deep as a grown man's should in the soft earth, and the spacing between them, sometimes 3 feet, sometimes 6, as if whatever made them had staggered and lurched erratically. A sudden gasp from the front of the group. Priest Tanaka stood frozen before a crumbling stone torii gate, its once vibrant vermilion paint now faded to the color of old blood. Beyond it lay a forgotten shrine, its wooden structure half consumed by the forest. The Kamidana altar was cracked down the middle, and the Shimenawa rope hung in tatters. But most disturbing were the hundreds, of red cloth strips tied to every available surface, fluttering gently despite the absence of wind. "It's the Yurei Hana," breathed Mrs. Kobayashi, crossing herself in a strange syncretic gesture. "The ghost flowers." In local folklore, these red cloths marked places where the dead crossed over, each strip representing a soul claimed by the mountain. The blood trail ended abruptly at the base of the altar. There, arranged with deliberate care, lay Sadayuki's hunting rifle and axe, both spotlessly clean, gleaming in the dappled forest light. But it was what rested between them that made Priest Tanaka stumble backward, his Ofuda charm falling forgotten to the mossy ground, a single perfect handprint in the dirt. Small, delicate, undeniably that of a child. As the villagers stood frozen in horror, a sound echoed from deep within the shrine, a wet, clicking noise like bones being ground together. Then, so faint they might have imagined it, a child's giggle. The forest exhaled, the red cloths rippled as if in greeting, and somewhere in the depths of the mountain, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes. The villagers returned from the forest like ghosts themselves, hollow-eyed, trembling, their clothes damp with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the morning mist. They spoke in fragments, their voices breaking like rotten wood underfoot. The shrine. Handprint too small. Red cloths moving when there was no wind. By nightfall, the story had already begun to curdle into something darker. The village elders gathered in the headman's house, the air thick with the acrid smoke of cheap tobacco and fear. Priest Tanaka sat stiffly, his hands clutching a cup of untouched tea gone cold. His usually pristine white robes were smudged with dirt from the forest, as if the very earth had tried to claim him too. "We must burn the Kamoshita house," said old man Yamada, his voice cracking like dry kindling, "and seal the forest path." But the priest was staring at the table, his finger tracing a pattern only he could see. "You don't understand," he whispered. "That shrine, it wasn't abandoned. It was waiting." Then he told them the real story, the one not written in any village record. Generations ago, when Tsuyama was just a handful of huts clinging to the mountainside, the first settlers had found something in these woods, not a shrine built by human hands, but something older, a yorishiro, a vessel for spirits that predated Buddhism, predated even the Shinto gods. The original villagers had tried to appease it with offerings, rice, sake, the occasional goat, until one winter, when the snows came too early and the crops failed. That winter, Tanaka said, his voice dropping to a whisper, they gave it a person. A silence thicker than the forest mist settled over the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers. The Kamoshita family. Mrs. Kobayashi began, then stopped, her wrinkled hand flying to her mouth. Tanaka nodded grimly. "Their farm borders the old offering ground. And Sadayuki's grandmother. She was the last Miko who knew the proper rites. As if summoned by the words, a sudden gust blew out the lanterns. In the darkness, something scraped against the outside wall. Long, slow drags, like claws testing the wood. The villagers froze, their breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, from the direction of the abandoned Kamoshita farm, a single gunshot echoed through the valley. Impossible. They'd brought Sadayuki's rifle back with them. The priest's face went ashen. "It's begun again," he said, and in the flickering light of the relit lanterns, the villagers saw the truth in his eyes. The mountain was hungry, and it remembered the taste of human flesh. The villagers' footsteps faltered as they emerged from the forest's grasping shadows, their faces ashen in the pale dawn light. The priest, Tanaka, clutched his broken Ofuda charm so tightly the paper edges cut into his palm. Blood welled in the crescent-shaped wounds, dripping unnoticed onto the sacred ropes now coiled at his feet like dead snakes. Behind them, the forest exhaled. The red cloth strips tied to the ancient shrine had begun vibrating, though no wind stirred the air. Slowly at first, then with increasing violence, they snapped like whips against the rotting wood. One tore free and went slithering through the undergrowth toward the village, leaving a glistening trail behind it that smelled of rust and spoiled meat. That night, the first dream came to Mrs. Kobayashi. She found herself standing in the Kamoshita farmhouse, though in her dream it wasn't abandoned. The shoji screens glowed with warm lantern light, casting moving shadows of a family sitting down to supper. But when she peered through a crack in the paper, she saw their faces were blank, smooth as eggs, yet somehow still screaming. At the head of the table sat Sadayuki, his mouth stretched far too wide as he spooned thick, dark liquid from a bowl into the waiting void where his face should be. She woke choking on the taste of iron. The next morning, 3 children reported seeing Uncle Sadayuki standing at the forest's edge at dawn. His clothes were muddy, they said, and he was smiling. When questioned separately, they all described the same impossible detail. His shadow stretched the wrong way, toward the rising sun rather than away from it. Priest Tanaka returned to the shrine alone at twilight, carrying a rusted temple bell that hadn't been rung in 50 years. The moment he stepped past the torii gate, the temperature dropped so suddenly his breath plumed in the summer air. The red cloth strips now formed intricate knot patterns he recognized from forbidden scriptures, binding spells used to trap spirits. At the shrine's base, the child's handprint had multiplied. Dozens of tiny palm prints now radiated outward in a spiral, each filled with a dark substance that pulsed like a living thing. When he bent closer, the substance surged upward, forming a perfect miniature human silhouette that reached for his face before dissolving into mist. The bell slipped from his numb fingers, striking the stone altar with a tone that seemed to shake the very trees. From deep in the mountain came an answering vibration, not an echo, but a response. That's when he saw them. Hundreds of red threads, nearly invisible in the fading light, running from the shrine into the forest. No, not running, pulling taut, as if something beneath the earth was reeling them in. Back in the village, the first homes began reporting missing items: kitchen knives, butcher's cleavers, a child's red hair ribbon, and from the abandoned Kamoshita farm, the sound of an axe biting into wood rang out through the still night air. The village of Tsuyama woke to silence. Not the peaceful hush of morning, but the thick, suffocating quiet of a held breath. The kind of silence that comes when even the wind fears to stir. In the week since the massacre, the villagers had taken to locking their doors before sunset. Not that locks would help. Not against what was coming. Priest Tanaka stood at the edge of the forest, his robes fluttering like a surrender flag. The once familiar path to the shrine had vanished, swallowed by undergrowth that seemed to have sprouted overnight, twisted brambles with thorns like fishhooks, their tips glistening red. Behind him, the village headman and a handful of elders waited, their faces drawn. A crow cawed, the sound like a laugh. "We should burn it," muttered old man Yamada for the 100th time, fingers worrying the faded omamori charm around his neck. Burn it all. But they all knew better. Theories had spread like rot through Tsuyama, each more terrible than the last. The police from the neighboring town had come and gone in a single afternoon, their boots tracking mud through the Kamoshita house. They declared it a clear case of murder-suicide, despite the lack of a body. Madness runs in mountain folk, one officer had whispered to another, not quietly enough. They took the rifle as evidence, left the axe, and never noticed the child-sized fingerprints pressed into the blood on its handle. At the izakaya, where the men drank to forget, stories surfaced like corpses in a river. How Sadayuki's grandmother had been the last to perform the old rites. How the Kamoshita land bordered the offering ground. How every 50 years, someone had to feed the mountain. Mrs. Kobayashi crossed herself with shaking hands. His grandmother knew. She tried to stop it. Tanaka had spent nights poring over moldering temple records. The truth was there, hidden between lines about bad harvests and missing children. Ansei 6, 3rd month. The Takanaka family lost to the woods. The red threads were seen again. Meiji 22, 7th month. The shrine must be appeased. Chio sacrificed before first snow. The last entry chilled him. Taisho 7. The Kamoshita Miko warned us. The threads are pulling tighter now. The gaps between feedings grow shorter. A university folklorist arrived on the 8th day, her tape recorder and notebook out. She spoke of mass hysteria and shared trauma, her polished shoes kicking up dust from the Kamoshita porch. When she played back her recordings that night, the static between answers formed words in an archaic dialect. Feed us. We remember your face. By the 2nd week, the nightmares came for everyone. Children woke screaming about the red-wrapped people standing at their bedsides. Livestock were found drained of blood, their carcasses arranged in perfect circles, and every morning new strips of crimson fabric appeared, tied around doorknobs, woven into hair, coiled like snakes in rice barrels. The final proof came when the headman's daughter sleepwalked to the forest's edge at dawn. They found her kneeling, her small hands pressing into the earth, leaving perfect prints in the soft soil. When they pulled her away, she whispered with a voice not her own. Almost time for the dance. That night, Priest Tanaka stood before the village, his once white robes now dyed red with the cloth strips that had appeared on his altar. The look in his eyes silenced them all. It's not choosing victims anymore, he said softly. It's choosing dancers. Outside, the wind carried the sound of something laughing, and from the darkness between the trees, a dozen pale shapes began to sway. The village of Tsuyama had become a corpse, its heart ripped out and left to rot in the summer sun. For 3 days after the massacre, no one dared approach the Kamoshita farm. The house stood silent, its shoji screens flapping like the gills of a dying fish whenever the wind blew. By the 4th morning, the stench of decay had grown so thick it clung to clothes and hair, a cloying perfume of spoiled meat and something darker. The iron-rich scent of old blood mixed with the electric tang of lightning about to strike. The official investigation, a farce in 3 acts. The police from Takahashi City arrived with fanfare and left with nightmares. Chief Inspector Kobayashi, a man built like a sake barrel with a face to match, declared it an open and shut case within hours. Mad farmer snaps, kills family, flees into woods to die, he announced to his subordinates, mopping sweat from his brow. The flies were particularly bad that day, clustering thickest around the blood-stained tatami where the bodies had lain. They didn't notice the way their flashlights flickered when pointed at the cellar stairs, the child-sized handprints on the ceiling beams, impossible reach for any living Kamoshita child, that all the mirrors in the house were shattered from the inside. When they took the rifle for evidence, the youngest officer swore he heard something whisper arigato from the empty gun cabinet. The village's secret knowledge. At the izakaya, the elders drank themselves into a stupor, their usual reserve drowned in cheap shochu. Old man Yamada, his hands shaking worse than usual, described finding the shrine. The Kamidana altar. It wasn't broken from age. He gulped his drink. Something punched out from inside. Like a chick hatching. Mrs. Kobayashi added her piece between sobs. How her granddaughter now woke screaming about the faceless dancers. Every night. How the doctor found red threads under the child's fingernails no matter how often they were cleaned. Most damning of all was the ledger from the village store. Flipping through its pages revealed a pattern. Every 49 years, a sudden spike in sales of red fabric and sake. The last entry before Sadayuki's rampage. Kamoshita S. 10 bolts crimson silk, premium grade, paid in full. Tanaka's transformation was the most horrifying to witness. Once a bastion of calm spirituality, the priest now moved like a marionette with half its strings cut. He spent hours at the abandoned shrine, his once white robes now stained the color of old blood from kneeling in the polluted earth. The Takanaka family volunteered their eldest. The threads receded for a generation. The Yoshida girl wept as we led her to the stones. Her screams stopped at dawn. The harvest that autumn was bountiful. The Kamoshita Miko is dead. The mountain remembers. It will take its payment in full. A team from Tokyo University arrived on white motorcycles, their GoPros and EMF detectors as out of place as surgical tools at a seance. Professor Hayashi, an expert in folk religions, scoffed at the superstitious nonsense, until they played back their thermal footage. There, clear as day in the Kamoshita kitchen, a human-shaped heat signature reaching for a knife that wasn't there. When enhanced, the figure's face resolved into something that made the professor vomit onto his expensive loafers. That night, their audio equipment captured the sound of something large moving beneath the house. And laughter. So much laughter. By week's end, Tsuyama had become a village of ghosts. Every morning revealed new red knots tied around door handles. Livestock were found drained of blood, their corpses arranged in mocking facsimiles of family portraits. Children's drawings increasingly depicted the same scene, faceless figures dancing around a tree that bled. The final horror came when Priest Tanaka gathered the villagers at dawn. His robes were now entirely crimson, the fabric moving slightly in the absence of wind as if breathing. When he spoke, his voice had changed, deeper, wetter, with something clicking behind his teeth. The dance must be completed, he intoned. The mountain has chosen its new Miko. Behind him, the headman's daughter stepped forward, her eyes rolled back to show the whites. In her hands she clutched a strip of red silk that seemed to slither like a living thing. From the forest came the sound of drums, and something, many somethings, began to move toward the village. Police ignore evidence, Academics rationalize the irrational ledger entries, and temple records prove this is a repeating cycle. The red threads become an invasive, living presence. Spiritual leader becomes the herald of doom. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.